don't say now. We are on that.
Oh my God.
Are we live?
Right up.
Does anybody hear me? See me?
Okay, I think we're ready to get started. And Matt, you're ready, right?
See me?
Okay, I think we're ready to get started.
Yes.
And Matt, you're ready, right?
I'm ready.
I think we're ready to get started.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a continuation. It's a much more polished version of what I talked about 2 weeks ago. So I guess I'll just give like a quick table of contents of what I'm about to show. Like just I'll scroll through a few figures here. I'll also point to the whiteboard a little bit. I'll start by pointing at the whiteboard and just introduce this notion. I just came up with the word yesterday to describe what I'm talking about. I call it a partial pose. That might be a placeholder.
Thanks for joining, Jeffrey.
There's a good chance. It feels like a really nice idea.
I'm gonna try and keep quiet.
So I'm guessing people have thought of it before, and it has a name, but I just haven't found it. And so the general idea is, I think, a lot of processing in the visual system does not occur in this form where you're seeing objects at like particular locations, like this cube that's nearby and this cylinder that's far away. A lot of the processing can happen in this world where what you're representing is an object at an orientation at a certain position on my retina and a certain size on my retina, which is different from actually representing the depth of it, because it keeps them
the distance.
The
distance.
Sure, distance.
Okay.
Yeah. Which keeps ambiguous how far away the objects are and how large they are. And I want to argue here that that it seems really likely to me that the visual system does a lot of its object recognition in this system. And now to bring this back to showing figures here, I just want to make it clear that I'm really extending our cortical column model to make it do
Can I just
that.
be clear about this?
Yeah.
Again, I want to make sure I got it right. So when I hear that, of course, as I argued before, we know where things are.
Yeah.
But could this be you're saying when I do inference of the object in the what pathway, I'm not taking advantage of that information, but I do know it in the where pathway?
You generally know it in the where pathway.
Okay, so it's not like we don't process it. It's
right.
just when I'm doing object inference of what processing, then you're saying it's not a key component.
Right.
Okay.
So like in this, just read the sentence. In this write-up by extender model, so that it can recognize spatial arrangements of components without needing to solve the ambiguity between whether the sensed object is nearby and small or distant and large. Then I follow it up by saying the model does solve the ambiguity. It does figure out distances, but it happens in a separate complementary process.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, just to show like I'm going to scroll through the figures without going through them in detail, but just to show what this is. I talk about the subpopulations of layer 6 in the cortical column, and I have the same back and forth between layer 4 and layer 6 that we have currently today. But I divide up the representations in 6 differently. I also show where thalamic scaling fits into this, having this notion of how large the object is on the retina and passing that down to the thalamus so that it can.
Using that in the what pathway as well?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're doing the scaling even though you're trying not to recognize the object using distance or something. Because this thalamus is then representing the distance, but is it not? Or are you saying it's representing something else?
No, it's representing the size on the retina, the size of the image on the retina.
Which is generally related to the distance, but okay, now I'll have to wait and see how it works.
And as I go through this, I kind of do this left and right thing where I show in the cortical column or in neural populations how this all connects together. And then analytically, basically I'm defining what these are. And in the write-up, right immediately after this, I walk through these variables. I say like this orientation of the sensor relative to the object. How do neurons represent it? I tell about these variables. Just to breeze through this to show the rest of it. I then have the second section where I talk about layer 5 and layer 6, or where layer 5 is defined as our displacement cells layer, which may be layer 5, which is possibly layer 5. And I talk about what it represents and how it essentially represents the same thing that it represents today, with this extra notion of relative size. I add this extra variable of relative size. And so that's the part.
you saying what we have today, that's still displacement, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, it's, when I say what we have today, that can mean different things. For example, in our papers, we only talked about we didn't talk about orientation very much in our
Yeah,
papers.
so like we said, it was missing, so.
Yeah. So I guess when I just said what we had today,
It's still displacement, but including orientation and relative size.
sure, you could say that it has,
Is that right?
yeah.
Because those are the two things that were missing.
Yeah.
The displacement, right?
Yeah,
So,
But I would say the thing where this is the first research meeting where we're discussing it is relative size. We've talked about relative orientation before.
well, we have relative size, like the size of the logo on the cover of it. That
Sure.
Size has to be.
So see, yeah.
So that, we knew that had to be represented someplace, we had no way, we didn't know how. So you're proposing it's all still in like 5, but is it correct, can I read this as 3 subpopulation of cells, or is it just 3 things that are represented?
3 populations of cells. Each of these I've intentionally guessed at how neurons would probably
So can I
represent
just
this.
your diagrams, and each box is a cell population of some sort?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then can I interpret layer 6 as representing both layer 6A and 6B? Is all of layer 6?
I would say all of layer 6. Okay. I haven't specifically defined that. I'm using enough.
There's not another layer 6B that you're thinking about. So
right.
Because here you're showing layer 6 to layer 5. And,
yeah.
Okay. So basically all of layer 6, 6A and 6B, and some other stuff. And then multiple subpopulations in layer 5.
Yeah, so I'll go back up to the first image where I show more of the layer 6 connections to the thalamus, for example. These different subpopulations, some of it involves feeding back to the thalamus, some is more focused on feeding up to layer 4. And one of these just kind of lives in here alone. And this could be like the cortical cells, or this could be something that's more the other layer 6 populations that are not projecting out of the deep layers.
So can you just, in this diagram, tell us what those different things are? I think I know what orientation is, but now you've got X hat.
Yeah.
Some S.
Yeah. So for this, is probably best for me to point at the board. So I'll just jump over to this side because it's the same thing but just described in neural populations. So I'll just go in order. Orientation. So I'll just go in order with the diagram. So orientation is orientation of the sensor relative to the object, which is like a point on the surface of a sphere and a point in a ring. I'll come back to these labels later.
Is it correct to say that that's a specific implementation of orientation, but can I understand your whole thesis without accepting that?
Yes.
So that's a potential implementation, but we do need to represent our 3-dimensional orientation.
Yeah.
Somehow. That may be the way, but the system holds true even if it was a different way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and you can think of that as like if a camera is held in place or an eye is held in place, as it rotates, these are changing and the rest isn't. This is how the camera is pointing and rolled and everything.
Okay.
Now X hat is in the space of the object, the sensor is somewhere in the space of the object, and a vector points outward from the object toward the sensor. A unit vector saying like, okay, where am I viewing this from? And that is X hat.
Location.
It's a direction from it's the direction from the object to the sensor. The direction in the reference frame of the object that points to the sensor.
That sounds somewhat like orientation, doesn't it? I mean, it's not a distance, right? You're saying it's not a distance.
Right.
So then it's more like so the opposite of the orientation, right? It's in, I don't know what kind, it's not.
Well,
it's not grid cells. It's
so one answer is it's a location. It's a location in polar coordinates.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's a location. The location in polar coordinates is essentially what on the diagram there, X hat and S. I kind of group them together. Those can be interpreted as a polar coordinate location. So it's a direction.
Okay, that's confusing me because earlier I was arguing that orientation could be considered a polar coordinate system for location. So you're separating that out now. So I'm getting a little confused.
So I think part of the confusion comes from when you're dealing with these 2D projections of objects. The location of the sensor determines which projection you're seeing, which means that like the language can get confusing, that the viewed orientation, like whether you're seeing like this, or I should not use a symmetric object here. I'll do that, but and then whether you're seeing this or seeing it straight on, is not orientation. That's actually location. That's location of the sensor determines which of these you're seeing.
Yeah, but it's a location in polar coordinates, right?
Yeah.
So okay, so I'm still confused because earlier I was using the term orientation as a polar coordinate system. Remember I was saying you can recognize where you are or do an inference on movement in polar coordinates. So I'm just trying to understand your terminology. So in my mind, there's sort of there are two polar coordinates. There's two two non-Euclidean geometries here. One is you're calling orientation, and one you're calling x hat, I guess.
Sure. So what I could have done was I could have done x hat and d to do like where let's see. I'll make that x hat. This vector from here to here is x hat. Suppose this sensor is here, and d is this. Polar coordinates would have been this. Polar coordinates would have been where is the sensor, like the direction from the object to the sensor and the distance. This x hat is confusing now.
Yeah.
So this is d.
Yeah.
Can I take a crack at?
Yeah.
Helping me out.
Well, I think part of the confusion is both are kind of orientation-like.
Yeah. That's right.
So the first one, the way I interpret it is, it's the location, let's say this is my eye, it's the location of the eye in the reference frame of the object.
Okay.
Includes the orientation, includes an angle and a distance.
Okay, that's
the top one.
That's we just did there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in addition, the eye can also rotate.
Okay.
And when it rotates, that first thing doesn't change.
Yes.
But you need to know both in order to know how the object projects onto your retina.
Okay.
And so the bottom one is
The bottom
Yeah,
one
what
is
is-
the x
the bottom one there, which is
orientation.
is how your eye might be rotating around its axis
Okay.
without changing the
Okay.
location.
I can. That's fine.
And you need to know both in order to
I
know the
find the
projection.
terminology hard for me, but it's not hard for other people. That's because they both feel like.
But fundamentally, there's two separate things that you
Yeah, I
have
can
to
see
know.
the
in
two
order
separate
to-
things. There's one's label
understand.
orientation, one's label like hat. And I don't know why.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
That could be a notation thing.
So there are two three-dimensional vectors. One of them has a distance, and one of them has a unit vector. The one that's in the sensor's unit coordinate frame is a unit vector.
Well, both of them are in the objects, the reference frame.
Sorry, the rotation of the sensor is the x hat object on the sensor, and that's a unit vector.
What's the unit vector?
So
It doesn't have the dimension. It doesn't have the
distance, yeah.
right, a unit vector is a vector of length 1, which can always be thought of as a direction. So yeah, when the sensor rotates, the orientation updates. So I guess, sorry, Jeremy, could you ask the
My
question?
question was only whether x hat is unit vector and ORI is a three-dimensional vector that has distance. They're both three-dimensional vectors. I guess I'm just confirming. Both are three-dimensional vectors.
It's just an orientation doesn't have a distance at all.
Oh, okay, so the orientation is the unit vector.
So ORI is a 3D orientation. And that's really the best way to describe it is the 3D orientation. It's there's no notion of distance there.
Isn't that what a unit vector is for? The non-distance directional 3D coordinate?
Well, keep in mind, orientation is truly 3D, 3 degrees of freedom. A direction is 2 degrees of freedom.
If it's polar.
Sure, if it's polar or, yeah. So they're two different things. And orientation is not just like an arrow pointing somewhere. It's an arrow pointing somewhere and a roll around that arrow. And so orientation is not the same thing as
It's a roll around that arrow.
the spin. You point in the direction. This is an arrow pointing out of a sphere. This is a ring around that
Oh,
arrow.
okay, I'm taking, yeah, okay, I'm ignoring that.
So the bottom one is the ORI.
Yeah.
and the top one is the
So,
X hat.
so I think the more
And
important
that's-
thing to me is that, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I was just trying to map the notation to.
Yeah, they're flipped around. I didn't really plan on pointing back and forth like this, but they're flipped around.
So to me, I'm just trying to keep these things straight. One is, the thing you just talked about, the X hat and the D is basically, they're sending out something in front of me and its position relative to me. That's that, it's rotating around, those things change.
Mhm.
If it moves, the D changes, if it doesn't move, then.
Yes.
Right. The other one is that, given that thing, where's my eye? It's moving around like this. Is that right?
Yeah,
Okay, so to me, those seems more, those are like just two flip sides of the same problem. They don't seem, like one's from the perspective of the eye and one's from the perspective of the object. Is that correct?
that's, let me think. The
You
issue
can't
there.
derive one from the other.
Yeah, right,
No,
right.
I know, but
You need
It's not two orientations. If you had two orientations, that wouldn't tell you where they are. That wouldn't tell you relative locations.
I wasn't arguing that.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I just said
that's what we're arguing.
they're somewhat similar in the sense that
Yeah.
both of them are a polar direction and one has a distance. Is that correct? They're both sort of polar coordinate. You've got a circle and a sphere and a ring, or maybe not, I don't know.
I mean, I've definitely there's definitely stuff in common, but there's also a reason one of these is a point on a sphere and a scalar, and one is a point on a sphere and a ring. Like there is also a fundamental difference. But yes, you can try to unify them in certain ways.
Yeah, well, to my perspective, this has been a confusing topic from the beginning because we've talked about orientation. And I think what you're trying to do here is say, hey, there's two separate sort of orientation-like components. We need to think of them separately. That's how I'm interpreting what you're saying, so I could be wrong. One is, think about, the object's position relative to you, and the other is your eyeball, your sensor's position relative to the object. Is that not right?
I guess I'm not really making that case right now. I guess I've always thought that location and orientation are these two separate things. That's not what my focus right now, but I
No,
also
neither. I wasn't talking about.
I also agree with what you just said.
Neither one of those is location. I'm just saying you're breaking out two different types of orientation. The orientation of my eye relative to the object and the orientation of the object relative to my eye. Is that not correct? You're not disagreeing with it.
Well, no, because those are really two sides of the same thing. The orientation of eye relative to object and orientation.
That's your orientation thing there, right?
Essentially the inverse of it. Orientation of, relative, you're totally correct. I shouldn't have said the inverse thing.
I'm just trying to, it's helpful for me to get the language right. That's all I'm trying to really get. I'm trying to get my head around the language so I intuitively understand the language you're using.
Mhm.
I'm not quite there yet. So I'm going to try and push you on this a bit.
Mhm.
I can let you keep going, but I'll start getting more and more confused as I get into it. But
Trying to decide if I should say right now.
is the S object, is that, you got movement going to it. As soon as you see movement going to it, I think of it's grid cells. Is that not?
The grid, the movement's going into all of these populations.
Oh, it goes into all of them. Oh, I see,
yeah.
it goes into the broader box.
Yeah.
Got it, sorry, I misread that.
This one is this scaling factor here.
Oh, S stands for scale.
Yeah, it's a scaling factor in general.
So the X hat and the S, those two next to each other, is that like this X hat and the D there? Is that what that is? The S is the D?
It's the S is has one-to-one relationship with the D, but it's actually this is the size on the retina. I decided that size on the retina was a better thing to represent than the distance. Although I could have just as easily made this be a D, kind of a weird scale invariant D.
Okay, so it really isn't distance, it's just size on the retina.
Yeah. So I talked about polar coordinates to just get your head in the right place, but it is size on the retina.
And then the other one represents size.
This one, maybe the best way to think of it is it's a gain for path integration. It's a gain factor. Like if I move 5 inches to the right with my sensor, how far do I move to the right in the object space?
So it's not rotating my eye, or it's moving my eye.
Yeah. Once you've inferred that, then you truly know the distance of the object. You truly know its 3D location. But before you know that, you don't know that yet. So I will just scroll through just to show the remaining figures, just to give you a sense what I did. So I defined the variables, showed the other 2 layers, and then the 3 remaining figures are all variations on the same thing, where it's in this walkthrough section. This walkthrough section, I go through time, a series of events occur, and variables are inferred. I could have also drawn cortex diagrams here and pointed at it, but I just described the variables. And I walk through over time what happens. First, I talk about how the gain is inferred, which is to say, you see an object, you move to the side, you see it again, and you use the 2 images.
I'm not just rotating my eyes.
Right, moving physically, because that's always needed for depth perception. That's all, if you have one eye and you're trying to disambiguate how far something is, then.
But we're able to do that without moving, right?
I mean, because we have other tricks, but I didn't want to bring other things into this.
We have 2 eyes.
Well, even if you have one,
I think so.
just one eye, and I don't mind, I can look out and you would flash inference, I can look around, I know the depth of it.
Sure, you have the focal point thing. You can figure out how far you have to stretch it.
It's more based on the fact I have various things. I have various shows of occlusion events occurring.
I didn't want to bring those into this.
No,
I have a point of view on those.
I want to get at a fundamental question here. So, but if I see a chair, like the yellow chair in the kitchen, I know how far away it is. I don't have to move my head because I know I know the size of that chair.
Yep.
Therefore, regardless of any other piece of data, my model of the chair will tell me that chair is
Correct.
a certain distance from me.
Correct.
Is that accommodated here?
Yeah. Well, my point of view on that is that these gain factors for path integration, you remember them. For a familiar object, for your coffee cup, you see it. Your coffee cup, it has a particular size. So you're able to, you look at it, you're like, oh, that's my coffee cup. I know how far away it is because I know how big it is.
Well, I'm just trying to understand this because you're saying you start out by saying I don't really know how far away.
This is for learning a novel object.
This is for learning a novel object.
Yeah.
But it says inferring.
So, I mean, inferring the gain factor between sensor.
So is if I read this, if I go up there, but let's say this is I mean, you say inferring gain, but this is really learning a novel object. Is that clear if I read this?
So I guess when you read it in context, I talk about the 3 walkthroughs I'm going to do. I guess it's just that I'm showing you paper out of context. So, I mean, and first I show how the gain factor is inferred through sensation and movement. Then I show how the spatial relationship between 2 objects is calculated so that it can be learned.
Again, I'm coming in here, if I saw this, I wouldn't know that this is learning a novel object. I would assume you're just doing inference. So I would have been confused. So because it makes a difference, right? It's just this idea of, because it caught my attention, you said, hey, I won't be able to tell the distance. I have to infer that by moving. I said, no, I can do that for learned objects. So I'm just pointing out that when I read this, I might get confused if it didn't say this is for a novel object. I don't know the size of it, something like that. Otherwise, I'm assuming that I'm inferring something that I already know, in which case I would disagree with some of the things you said, which I don't really think I disagree with.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's just the ordering of things. It's hard to know the order of things. How to say
more or less
things.
sort of just setting up expectations clearly so that someone like myself is also going to get lost.
So do you treat the situation where you do have a strong prior on the size?
I don't treat it, but I leave it open to that. I'm very much open to that possibility. I talk about that briefly in once on the next page. So the diagrams, I was giving you a sense here. I think I should start now with motivations. How I have these 3 walkthroughs. The first thing was, inferring the gain factor, figuring out how large the object is. Second part was learning a spatial relationship, or inferring the spatial relationship so that it can be learned. And then
that's the spatial relationship between like a compositional structure.
Yeah. And then finally, inferring an unseen component from a seen component.
So that has to be a learned object.
Yeah, you're using a learned object. You see an image. You don't even have to infer the gain. You don't have to infer how large this particular instance of this object is. And
Because I have a memory of it.
no, but no, it can even be much larger. It could be a photo of it. It could be a larger or smaller version. You might see a tiny elephant. Or you might see a.
Okay.
This is more that scenario. You can see something where you can recognize the object without. You don't necessarily have to choose its size. You don't necessarily have to choose its actual distance from you. The object recognition system can work without doing that.
Because you're just planning, or you're just predicting where a component is going to exist on whatever side of the object is. So it's gonna become a saccade at some point to some of the locations.
So yeah, you can predict where it's going to be on your retina without that's the core idea. And so, okay, those are the 5 figures. Now I'll interlude here to make a little bit of a case that that a lot of our object recognition system, I think, happens in this kind of space where I'm calling this partial pose. I'm calling it the direction. To pause for a second. The location on your retina of the image, the size on your retina of the image, and what the what the image is. Those 3 things, or rather the orientation of what you're seeing. The idea is that inference happens in that world. I'll walk through an inference process here, but first I wanted to motivate it with like a clip that came to mind. I will bring up our friend David Eagleman, and
city streets just like this one.
I think I can go one ahead.
It's a model that I've already constructed. Updating it, refining it.
It's a few seconds away.
Our brains are so good at doing this that we're normally unaware of it. But sometimes, under certain conditions,
I don't think
we
this
can
is.
see the process at work.
I don't think this is specific to faces, but
Sorry,
This
folks,
is
I'm
all
not getting the
mass
stream.
of Einstein space.
It's from Eagleman's
Your brain
the
tells
Brain
it it's
series.
coming out at you. And even when you know it's an illusion, you can't help but fall for it.
Can't really see it.
What you're seeing is the internal model, not the raw information that's coming in from your eyes. Your internal model is
It's
built
like
on
the
a
depression
lifetime
of the
experience
face,
with
and you
faces
can't
that
tell
stick
whether it's
out.
coming out towards you or going away from
When you're
you.
confronted with one that's hollow, your model simply sees what it expects to
Can
see.
barely see it.
okay, that's the entirety.
The visual
So I think that, okay, the model I'm laying out here is very much compatible with what we just saw. The idea, and I don't think it's specific to faces. I've seen like art pieces that play with this fact that like you can have a bunch of random shapes floating in air. And if you view it from a certain angle, suddenly your mind sees a 3D shape that you're confident isn't there. You had all of the path integration cues you need to know that that object's not there. But your visual system will still see a 3D object floating there if you view, if all of it coherently says the object's there, like a face, like Einstein's face inverted, you see it sticking out. I think that there's good reason to believe that the visual system and how it recognizes objects kind of does it all by what images are on the retina, and by predicting from one component. It's like, okay, I see this one sub-object, this one child object. Therefore, I probably will see this other child object at this other point on my retina at a certain retinal size. But a lot of this processing lives in just that language purely. It never has to go into the language of how far each part is away. And that's why that allows the system to be more powerful. It also allows the system to be fooled. And basically, I'm describing a model that works in that
Well,
way.
isn't that the same as basically just looking at a picture or something? Where the actual image pieces are all, coplanar. But they're, I perceive it as a face.
Yeah.
I know it's not flat.
Yeah.
Is it the same? As
Yeah, I would perceive, and yes, I totally agree.
That's a simpler version as opposed to going through the whole 3D math thing. It's just saying, like, I take something, I project that on a plane. Obviously, the distance between those object subcomponents is not defining that image that I'm seeing.
Yeah.
I see it as a building, even though it's all flat, but I know that's a three-dimensional building. I'm not fooled. With that, I'm being fooled by its dimensionality. But if I look at a picture of a building, I say, oh yeah, it's a building, but I'm not fooled by its dimensionality. It's just so different. But the same idea is, the only information I have to work with is the relative positions of those things, no depth.
Right, well, I would say that the Einstein thing is almost demonstrating why we're able to see pictures, why we're able to look at a photograph and parse it and see 3D objects, because our vision system is so not dependent on actually assigning depths to everything.
Yeah, I find it the opposite. I find that it's simpler for me to say it as, like, when you see that mask, it's very difficult. There's shadows, all that weird stuff going on. But if I say, here's a flat picture, I'm just talking about me personally.
Yeah.
Me personally, it's easier to explain the problem. Your argument is, I can infer an object about knowing the depth of the object.
Yeah.
Or the components.
Yeah.
And so in that thing with an Einstein mask, there is depth. It's just the wrong depth.
Sure.
So to me, like, the simpler example is you just take out all the depth and I still see this as a building.
Yeah, I could have used that example for this model.
So I think that's a stronger argument in my mind for the need for inference without depth. But then I think you're also arguing, to learn that object, I need to move in whatever dimension you have.
In this current model, for me to keep it simple, I require movement to infer the actual 3D
Well, I think
arrangement of objects.
it's physically obviously necessary. If I have a picture of something, or if I'm recognizing something that way, and I have a picture of it, and I'm not relying on depth, then if I have to move to be able to see how the object changes and the relative positions of things change, right? I can't learn the structure of a building by moving relative to a picture, but I can do it relative to a 3D building, in which case all the components are moving relative to each other.
Right. The way I think of that is I've considered whether a sequel to this model will try to learn objects from pictures, which I can't currently do.
No, I'm
And
not suggesting
sure if
I'm
we
not
should.
suggesting that at all.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm going to argue you can't.
Yeah.
Like, I can't learn what a building is by looking at a picture of a building. Unless I have some prior knowledge about buildings, and this is a new building or something like that. But if I just start up a priori, there's no knowledge about the world and the structure of the world, I'm gonna show you a picture, I can't possibly learn the structure of that, physically impossible, of course. And so therefore I would have to, and therefore I would argue without depth information, since I have to be able to recognize without depth information, I don't have, and assuming I don't have depth information, then I should be able to recognize by moving and having things change relative to each other. Right?
Yes.
I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah. I think an interesting discussion can happen about pictures and what can be learned from them and what can't. And I think it's the long discussion and the hand wavy that I don't.
I was using less about what can be learned from pictures,
Yeah.
but pictures just as an alternate example of Einstein's face, that inference can occur for a learned object without movement, and how do you do that?
So that I do in this.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the more interesting
So-
explanation how is it that I can do inference without depth? And I do that. Your argument, I don't need to know that depth to recognize the object.
Right.
That's one of your core arguments here.
Yeah.
So that's patently obvious if I look at a picture. But I would argue, of course, you have to move someone in depth to learn depth, to learn the object structure.
Mhm.
So you have to go back and forth between those two.
Yeah, so we're in sync. That's basically the assumption of this whole write-up and model. So I can now move on to, this process of recognizing objects. And here I've given kind of the playful, minimal version on a whiteboard because there's an accompanying paper where I show linear algebra and everything and talk about neural populations. So this is like the fun, intuitive explanation. When you see, okay, I'm gonna use these simple shapes like seeing cylinders that are composed into higher objects. Here I'm using the model of a hammer, which is composed of 2 cylinders that are arranged in a certain way. Which, just as an aside, this model is particularly appealing when these quote unquote objects are these simple things that are composed into bigger things. The idea that your eye needs to learn how to represent your visual cortex needs to learn how to recognize a small cylinder and a large cylinder, but it only has to learn those once. Such that this big image if you see a large cylinder on your retina, doesn't matter if it's actually a small one that's closer or a big one that's far away. It's the same partial pose. It's the same image on your retina, and that needs to be learned once. This idea that I'm speaking in sentence fragments, but I'm trying to motivate, like where I'm really coming from on this is not really specific. It's not coffee cups and logos. It is that a little bit, but I'm really motivated by parsing these simple shapes and arranging them into higher structures. That's where this really feels important to me.
Would it work with coffee cups? Are you?
It works with it, but
It's just going back to the.
For those, it's less.
What's that called? Some these visual components.
GMs.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's analogous to GMs, and analogous to how, like, for example, old MAR papers talk about, you look at a 4-legged animal, you parse it into kind of a set of cylinders like the head and the legs, and then you recognize that arrangement of cylinders.
Because there's nothing against that, except it has to also explain coffee cups and logos. I mean, and so, and then you get into these complex regressions when you try to do that. It's just, they start to fail. So I don't find that as a sufficient explanation. Maybe part of the explanation. So I'm hoping you can take from that genome type of thing to how do we generalize this to the more complex structures. Maybe you're not there yet.
No, not right now, or at least my head's not in that place right now.
Yeah.
So going back to this, suppose the sensor is attending to one part of its visual space, or perhaps looking at a certain part. Maybe this is the phobia. It's pointing at this, and it recognizes a cylinder. It recognizes the skinny cylinder at a particular size on its retina, and so I call that, it's recognizing a cylinder at a partial pose. For today, that's what I'm calling it.
It's not saying how big it is, it's just saying how big it is on the retina.
Yeah, and it does capture its the 3D orientation of the projection, but
that's your partial pose.
Yeah, and so given that, it can, for example, it can use that to recall, where have I seen skinny cylinders, and recall, oh, I've seen hammers before.
So when you're saying skinny, it's not the absolute size, you're just saying the aspect ratio that you're referring to.
Yeah. And it can recall a hammer or use some other reason, for whatever reason, this circuit recalls a model of a hammer. Maybe it just knows it's expecting to see a hammer somewhere. And using that, it can now predict, like, okay, so if I'm seeing a handle like this, I should see the head of the hammer up a little higher, and I show that in red as a prediction. And I'll argue that, like, I mean, I might seem like I'm hand waving. Maybe you're wondering at this point how it predicts that. I'm not sure if that's. I think it should be intuitively obvious that it's possible. That who cares how large the hammer is? If it's a hammer, I'm gonna see the head of this hammer at a different part of my retina.
Doesn't at a particular pose.
Yeah. So the intuition should make sense. This should be intuitively possible. And you'll just have to trust me to some extent that it works. But So now this process of, okay, I've inferred from, I saw the cylinder, I think I recall my hammer. I now realize that if I attend to this other location, I should see another particular cylinder. And it attends there, perhaps saccades there, but here I'm not really talking about movement. The movement works with everything. And it can confirm that, yes, I do see a hammer
Well, if
after
you
all.
don't saccade, then you're relying on some sort of horizontal, loading projections of some sort, right?
Yes, if it's not all falling in the receptive field of one column,
Well, assuming it's not.
Yeah. then
So that tells you something. If that's happening, then what's being communicated there is, well, let's see, what would be communicated there? You're communicating something about, okay, I think it's a hammer, but it's a hammer at a particular pose. It's not just hammer. Because if I'm going to predict the location of the retina and the physical size on the retina of the upper cylinder, I have to know its pose. It's a more complicated projection. It's not just hammer, it's hammer at a particular pose, and somehow that has to be interpreted by the receiving columns. I mean, that's a complex problem right there, right? If I have one column, let's say I have one column receiving the narrow, skinny cylinder, and another column that's going to predict the larger cylinder.
So one answer to all of this is the columns could all just vote on, because these are a location of the sensor, they're the location of the retina, or technically the pupil. All of the columns really can agree on that in the case of vision.
Agree on one thing.
All of them have the same location and orientation.
To the object, but I have to communicate to the other column the object and the pose of the object. Yeah, they all have this common position relative to the object.
Right.
Right. That's your whatever language you just used.
Yeah, and common, all of these dimensions will be the same for them.
But still, if I'm a column and I need to be able to predict a large cylinder, I need to know, what do I need to know? I need to know that this is a hammer, because I'm not seeing it yet, I'm predicting it. And I need to also know the pose, because otherwise I could predict, I might predict a different size on the retina of the big cylinder. Right? So given I have a knowledge of a learned hammer, I have to communicate a fair amount of information to the column.
Sure,
I
but
don't know how to do that, but
I mean, like these columns can, I mean, we'll call, here I haven't defined whether these are specific to objects. I'm just treating them as pure locations. We'll call that 6. And I don't know, I guess. Well, the first case I was making is that these can simply vote and activate the same.
these being all the different subcomponent components of 6, you're saying?
Yeah, all of them. Now, of course, this is specific to vision where everything is the same. When you talk about multiple hand sensors, you now have to capture their locations on the different locations on the body using, for example, the clustrum idea. But a lot, essentially, so somewhere, I'm gonna say this, somewhere object ID also gets voted on. Of course, I could have just called this layer 2, 3, but I'm just leaving it open.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's complex, but it's essentially just transmitting this information. These can all just vote on.
I'm just trying to imagine I'm a column and I'm trying to predict the larger cylinder. What information do I need to know? And when I say complex, I don't mean like bad or difficult. I'm just saying there's more information. What information do I need? It's not a simple thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an object ID. It's object ID plus pose information. And I don't even know how to interpret that, because it's like I have to know something about where the skinny cylinder is. There are many columns that could predict the large cylinder, but only one should because of the location of the skinny. I don't even have an answer to this. It's just confusing in my head right now. Like all the things I would need to know, it's not clear to me what those are. How I even go about it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
there's gotta be some common language that the two columns can use.
So here's another, you have a 2D sheet of columns.
Yeah.
This is one in the background. All of them, suppose they all activate the same object ID.
That
and the
being
same-
hammer, or.
Yeah, hammer.
That was
And-
hammer, got it.
And 6 being, the location relative to that hammer. And of course, as an aside, this object ID may not be necessary if we find a way to do this with object specific.
My object, the 6 being the location of the retina to the object, is that right?
Yeah, among other things. It's all 6 dimensions of, it's the partial pose. So it's where's the object on the retina and how is the projection oriented? And what's the size?
Okay.
What I was going to say is that suppose the entire V1 votes and agrees on these. Some of the columns are going to predict cylinders.
Yeah.
Some of them are going to predict cylinders. Others are going to predict nothing.
Yeah. Okay.
So I can just say a little bit more. These going back to these neural populations briefly. You recognize, points on surfaces of a sphere. The one that, of course, I never know the right way to draw is a scalar. If something is a scalar, I could have somehow drawn a rate code. This could be a rate code. Here I just draw it as like, maybe it's a scalar encoder, something. You should recognize these other ones: surface of a sphere, ring, scalar. It's interesting to just look at what these populations, what happens if you change one of these and what happens to the image. So the location of the sensor relative to the object, that's what we were calling x hat. That's the unit vector pointing from the object to the sensor. That's basically which projection you're sensing. Like, it's like, are you sensing this eraser from the corner? Are you seeing it straight on? It chooses which projection you're sensing. This size is the most obvious. Size on the retina just kind of scales up that projection, big and small. This, when you hold these constant, particularly when you hold this one constant, the orientation of the sensor, this part of it tells where the image is landing on the retina. So as you saccade around, this is essentially tracking, like there's an eraser on the surface of this sphere. This is essentially moving with it. It tells where it's landing on the retina. And the final remaining dimension is, okay, you know where it is on the retina, its size on the retina, which projection it is. Now the remainder is, well, it's kind of like the roll on the retina. It's kind of like if you rolling the image. These just struck me as the elegant way to do this. Like, for example, one of these, you want to pass it down to the thalamus for thalamic scaling, and it just seems to make sense like this, but that is the extent of my evidence that it's like this, is it just would make sense for it to be like this. The final part we haven't talked about much is the gain factor, the thing that it also represents how large the object actually is. The thing that you need to know, once you know the gain factor, then you can judge an object's distance from one image of it. So you know how large your coffee cup is, for example. So when you activate your coffee cup, it's going to implicitly activate, some value here. It might be right, but it's going to activate some value here, and that's going to be stable for that cup as you move around.
Yeah. Seems like you need to know that even for, you would know it for even the basic inference of the hammer. I mean, obviously I can learn a new hammer of different dimensions, but if I had to learn an object, it seems like the scale factor has to come into play. Again, as I said, I can just with one eye see the chair and how far away it is. So in that one eye inference step, it seems that that scale factor has to come into play. Would you agree with that?
Not really. I'm
Why?
here recognizing this hammer is recognizing a generic hammer. It is.
Yeah, but hammers don't come in all different sizes. And so I mean, again, I use a specific example of the chair because that's a learned object. So I'm just saying, it seems to me that somehow if the scale factor, if I understand what you're proposing it is just kind of think similar to what I proposed it is, but the scale factor seems to come into play when I see a learned object at some distance, because I know the distance. And you've worked on this theory without assuming I know the distance. You've worked on it saying, hey, I don't need to know the distance.
Yeah.
But I do know the distance. I've argued this before. And so, so fine. I just mean that part of the inference process of the learned chair is that scale factor is invoked. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a sense of its distance, and I wouldn't have a sense of the actual physical size of the object. Otherwise, I'd just say it's some construction of any dimension. I don't really know where it is. So all I'm saying is if I'm consciously aware of the distance of that object to me, somehow in the inference stage, that information is taken advantage of, or it's there.
The way I think of it is really very much like what Jeremy asked at the beginning of this is the idea of having some prior belief about the scale factor. However, that prior has sort of a range, like hammers. You have like this range of hammers that like a Gaussian around.
Yeah, but certain objects, it's very narrow range.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
So I'm using objects that I've learned. There's a very narrow range for them. If I see a triangle, there's no range. It's very broad, right? Because a little triangle is a big triangle in the world, but.
So earlier in this, I had an aside where I talked about how I think this model is particularly important when you're talking about these low-level components that are being arranged into complicated objects. Part of why I said that is I was anticipating this response. When we're talking about these full-on objects like actual hammers or actual coffee cups, you have a very strong prior about how their actual size. But when you want to talk about like what's going on what's going on to build up to that, I think in those building block layers of processing, you want something like this. It's more.
I agree, but I'm saying there are times when it comes into play, and times when it doesn't.
Yeah.
So we have to accommodate both. It's not totally separate processes. Right?
They're very much intertwined. I put them both in layer 6.
Yeah. Anyway, just also when we think about the voting that goes on between columns, the evidence is that it's layer 5A or 5B in some animals. It's not layer 6.
Fair.
I just throw that out.
Yeah,
It's something to think about.
Yeah.
That's the biology.
So really, this is the entirety of what I was presenting. Of course, like I go into detail and tried to make the paper nice, but I was hoping the intuition, the motivation would become clear with this. It's appealing to me, this idea that the inference process is essentially using these components to vote. It's dangerous for me to use the word vote right now. Here I'm using it more in like the Jeff Hinton way. The idea that when you see an eye, it votes for there being a face right here. When you see an eye here, there's probably a face here. You see an eye here, it agrees there's probably a face here. All right, we can all agree there's a face. The idea that the top of the hammer and the handle of the hammer are voting for there's a hammer right here. But my new development that other people have probably thought of before is that it's not voting on there's a hammer at this 3D location. It's voting on there's a hammer right here in my retina. And that's to me, this just, once the idea was in my head, I'm like, it's one of those things that felt like it had to be right. And at this point, It's open for how long you want this research meeting to be.
I want to think about it myself, so I should read your document. So for myself, I'm not gonna have one question unless someone else.
I mean, you're saying it's very retinal based, but at the same time, you don't have to learn it at all different, you don't have
Correct.
to see it at all different poses and stuff.
Correct. That's important.
You're
This is still,
you're still fundamentally an object-based
Yeah.
model.
yeah,
Just
the learned
referring it to
models.
the retinal
Exactly.
direction.
Exactly. And that is something that, like, if someone didn't, if that wasn't clear, because I never did say it explicitly, you learn this object once. I didn't talk about learning here, but it's still the case. You learn it once from one viewpoint, and all of these mechanisms will work from other viewpoints. So it's still a 3D model, but it just breaks up the processing of it a little bit differently. It untangles two parts. So the way I see it is it's untangling one part, still putting it in layer 6, still using it for processing movement, but treating it as a computationally a slightly distinct step.
So if we were to assume that, like, there's a web pathway and a where pathway, so we know from the web pathway, someone said, oh, I see this thing, but I have no idea where it is, right? That would imply that they just don't, that it's sort of along the line to your model here. It's like, hey, I can see this thing, I recognize it, but I don't actually know where it is. And so that's why I was asking earlier, like, well, the scale, the gain factor, that in the where pathway, that might represent the distance from me to the object. So I'm specifically thinking about the ceramic loop right now. And, okay, in a where pathway, that could represent, I don't know what it represents. I'm trying to figure out what would a web pathway and a where would I break this up into web pathway and where pathway components and how they work together, so I guess I'm trying to get at. So you're arguing for this object sort of inference and learning that's independent of depth, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a good intuition to focus on that, but at the same time, when we do know depth for most objects, and we also have to learn to scale the object. When I learn the object, I'll have to copy up with a chair. I'm just wondering what would be the two roles for the gain factor, the polemic loop, what pathway and where pathway. You have an vision and what maybe it's in your head, I just didn't follow it.
So I didn't talk about what and where. I was afraid to suggest that this is divided into what and where. And actually, it's funny, I arranged this visually in a nice way where I can now make my point. I was uncomfortable putting this in a where region because it's the only thing I would put there.
No, but we know that's not true. We know that the wet region and the where region are almost identical.
Yeah.
So you're gonna have both of these in both spots. And then you have to be changing your reference frames to that, right? So I guess that's a big component of this. I'm struggling to figure out how to parse that up so I can have both of these things in both sides and it would make sense.
Just going simply by the symmetry of like, okay, here's an answer that I'm winging it, but it feels like something you might like. So,
Don't do it because I like it.
okay, here I have two scalars. One of these is useful for thalamic scaling of the image.
That's the image on the retina.
Yeah.
Not the object, but the image on the retina.
Right. The other one's useful for, scaling of the movement vectors.
Okay, so let's take that as the one on the right would be a where pathway scale.
Yeah.
The one on the left would be a west pathway scale.
Yeah.
That's great. I like that. That's differentiation.
Yeah.
But now I expect to see the other parts on the where pathway as well. A full theory of sensory motor inference is going to have both of those, or sensory motor interaction, I should say. It's going to have both of those. I'm not just going to have the thalamic interaction on the right side here. And what I postulated before is that, okay, you take the same mechanisms, but just change the reference frame or from what perspective are you looking at this? And I'm just wondering, I haven't internalized this enough to make my own assessment of that. So I just didn't know if you had thought about that or not. It sounds like not.
Just briefly, the other statement I could make on that subject is, well, currently I'm doing the movement processing in layer 6 in the what region, essentially. If this is actually over in the where region, maybe the motor processing is also over here. Maybe motor commands are actually coming into this area, updating locations over here using this gain factor.
I would think
That may be the case.
The ideal situation is the motor behaviors are coming on both sides, and, but we don't know that, but that would be the ideal situation. Okay, so the two, you gave me a good partial answer to the question I wanted, which is, all right, at least you have the specific question I asked, what would be the role for the phonemic gain factor on both sides? You have an answer for that.
Yeah.
Which is good. Now, that just brings up the rest of the complicated machinery and how that parsed up, which you don't really know yet. Or not definitively.
Other thing I'll say about all of this, totally different, putting cortical columns aside, all of these principles apply to capsules as well. A system, someone could take a capsule network, train it in a particular way, so that it takes advantage of this idea of well, we'll call it this partial pose idea. Because, and there I see in particular, it might be really nice because it has these multiple layers of processing with then the object ones at the top. And I think that it would benefit those in between layers of processing. On the other hand, capsules are fully trained through back propagation and they'll just do whatever they want. For all we know, maybe they're already doing back propagation and they'll just like, maybe this is, you give them matrices to learn and they'll find that something that is relatively good and they might actually learn something like this. In that case, what this can provide to capsule people is giving them a theoretical understanding of what might get learned, giving them a sense, giving them the intuition for what is the system going to learn. I can show like, well, here's one thing that's elegant. Maybe that's why these capsules aren't doing what you're.
I thought capsules didn't incorporate any concept of movement.
Correct. The first one they essentially fed in locations. The first paper they did. So for that, they're like a stone's throw away from incorporating movement.
Okay.
More recently, they got away from movement. They just they have this notion of compositionality and learning these features and learning arrangements of them, but without incorporating movement. So it is a little bit more like black magic what it actually ends up doing.
Yeah.
My
intuition says it'd be really, really hard for this blind back propagation system to pick out the right sort of movement path integration type of property.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, it could be, I don't know, but it seems pretty unlikely.
No, it wouldn't until okay. It's definitely not going to do it just by default. If you somehow make it where it's trained while moving, if it's trained through back propagation while moving, then there's a chance it will.
Okay, yeah, but it still seems like, gosh, it would be so much easier if the neural machinery was designed for that, which it is, through evolution. Otherwise you might, I don't know what you discover, you might get, I don't know, it seems pretty unlikely that you get the right answer. If not, it's possible, I don't know. Interesting question.
Going back to cortical columns, one thing that's appealing to me about this is that it seems like we have almost a complete theory of all of layer 5 and layer 6, or at least a proposal for a theory.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I
The
think
different subpopulations and exact, maybe not specific neural mechanisms, but at least computational mechanisms for figuring out all of those
Right.
pieces.
yeah, go ahead.
At least it's a proposal, right?
Yeah.
And you could imagine actually building this.
Yeah.
And having it work, which is interesting. What's not covered by
So,
computational sampling?
okay, so you just pretty much said that, like, okay, if you look at this figure on the projector, each of these is the cell population, and I've specified exactly what that population could be, and so basically it's a complete model that is saying what these populations represent at any particular time, What it's not saying is, how am I actually computing one from the other?
But you can do that through matrices.
I can do it through matrices, but the neural circuit that does all that, I could do a brute force neural circuit that has like a very large number of synapses that does these mappings from one to the other. It's all possible. But developing an actual point of view on what that neural circuit is still an open question. So this is a ready-made model as is, if you accept me using magic to, using matrices, using math to compute one of these neural populations from the other.
I'd be hesitant.
Yeah, as I said, we also talked about this voting stuff, and maybe that's another, do we know exactly how the voting would work for partial poses and figuring all that out?
It's all doable. Nothing there scares me on the voting.
Yeah, and then
At least from the theoretical side. On the side of pointing at neural populations and figuring that out, there's still work to be done.
Yeah.
Theoretical side, I could wing it right now.
And then there's the aspect of generalizing from what to where. Like taking the exact, if we say that it's the exact same circuitry, what versus where, just putting labels on what the where column piece of it might be called. And you get one proposal for that piece of it.
There's more, that's a little more of a stretch though. Like the rest of what's going on over here, there's more work to be done there. I don't have a theoretical need for more over in the where. Unless I'm not going to make something up right now. We have interesting, like the seeds of an idea for what and where here, but there's more thought that needs to go into that.
I also, the other thing I've been starting to think about is like, okay, this is vision, how's it related to touch? What are the equivalents? These have to project onto the same fundamental, same processing. So how do I interpret touch in this point of view? I've made some arguments about that in the past, how to unite these two. But I have to think about that here. I guess you might have something that's modelable here, but I think it's got enough holes in it, not holes in a bad sense, but just missing components that that if you simulated it, you would gain something, but not as nearly as much as if you try to fill some of those holes first. That would be my intuition.
Okay.
Because simulating something like this is a huge amount of work, and you get it to work, but then where are you at the end of that? You still got all these big problems. And to me, my intuition says you got to identify the big problems still, the big missing pieces. And to me, you just mentioned something super time, and I've been trying to mention it myself right now. I feel like it would be better to do, for me, well, personally, I'm not having to do simulation, so it would be better to sort of dig deeper into trying to figure out what's missing components here and trying to figure out how they're solved in some way. But my understanding is that is not the intention right now, right? We're going to put this aside for the moment. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the current plan.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll pick it up again in a bit, maybe. Hopefully.
Yeah, on the simulation question, I'd say I'm not at I'm saying for simulations at this point, I wouldn't learn much from simulating.
Yeah.
I'm not going
I
into those
wasn't
questions.
suggesting
Yeah,
that
I figured.
simulated, it was more
just
that
wanted-
it's
okay.
computationally complete.
Sure.
I just want to make sure. Okay.
Understanding. I'm not suggesting.
Okay, well, I
simulation,
thought
so-
one could have interpreted that.
Yeah, I realized that's what I was saying. I didn't. But I meant it's more like it's a complete computational model. At least you know how you might.
Well, I still don't internalize it myself yet, but the big thing that I'm catching out is the big idea is the idea that this goes back to what pathway to do, which is you can recognize an object independent of its location. And you're extending that to like the idea of a projection on the retina, and how to interpret that, what concept as a retinal projection. And so thinking about it that way is, I think, is very, very fruitful, especially if you're doing. So I think that's, to me, that's a very, very high level component I'm getting at.
Hmm.
Maybe you think I'm missing something.
No, that's the idea.
Yeah. I'm gonna try to read your paper, maybe go through it carefully, but that's some mistake.
Yeah, the notation is a bit confusing. I mean, that could be improved.
Okay, I iterated on it for a while to land on this, but yeah. I mean, we can talk about that.
I have some thoughts on that too. Okay, anyone else? That's great, Marcus, thank you.
Okay, well, I think we're done.
All right.
All right, as soon as I log off the double, you guys will be offline.
Okay.
See you later. Okay.
Oh, that was interesting.
All right. Trying to leave this meeting. Don't remind me again. Oh, there it is. Leave the meeting. Okay. Thanks for watching. So you just saw a Numenta Research Meeting. We're moving from neuroscience-based meetings now to more machine learning-based meetings. So in the future, our research meetings will be focused on the application of HTM theory or Numenta theory to machine learning, deep networks, that sort of thing. So stay tuned for that if you are interested. And thanks for watching. I will be streaming this afternoon at 1 o'clock in about an hour and a half or so, doing more building HTM systems where we'll be talking about overlap duty cycles, active duty cycle periods, etc. So thank you for watching. Take care. See you later. Oh, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.